My name is Eric Richards. I'm a partner with the international law firm of O'Melveny & Myers. We're based in the United States, and we've done work in the U.S. aviation sector for over 75 years, including participation in many of the public-private partnerships and privatizations that have been either accomplished or attempted in the U.S. market. We're going to talk today about the U.S. market generally, but we're going to start with the Kennedy Airport, which is one of the hotspots where there's a significant amount of project activity underway. I'm joined by colleagues who I've had the pleasure of working with in prior matters in our market. Amit Rikhy, to my far left, who is president and CEO of Carlyle CAG Holdings, which is the global airport investment platform established by the Carlyle Group. Amit has over 25 years working in the industry, including working on over 50 airport P3 transactions. To my immediate left is Marie-Liesse Marc, who is Vice President of Acquisitions and Asset Management for Vantage Airport Group. She's responsible for developing and leading Vantage's growth initiatives, including the identification, evaluation, and negotiation of airport investments. She worked very recently on the very successful public-private partnership at New York's LaGuardia Airport, which is also overseen by the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, who has responsibility for JFK. So in addition to talking about JFK, Marie, I'm sure will treat us to some of her insights from prior interactions with that particular airport proprietor on another P3 project. As I said, we're going to talk about the U.S. market generally, but take advantage of the activity at JFK to use that as a launching board into the discussion. As many of you know, the U.S. market is a unique market. All of our commercial airports, virtually all of them, remain owned by public sector entities, in most cases local and municipal governments. Despite that, there's been historic collaboration, I would describe, between our public sector and private sector when it comes to airport development and operation. The nature of that relationship has been evolving and continues to evolve, and you've seen in our marketplace experimentation with outright airport privatization, but also with public-private partnerships of different scales and types as the market tends to seek more private sector participation, which I think is welcomed to improve both operations and development efficiency. So it's appropriate that we start with JFK as a launching pad for that discussion. It's currently, as I noted, a place where a number of transactions are being proposed regarding the redevelopment of the entire airport in the vision of the Port Authority and New York's Governor Andrew Cuomo. Both Amit and Marie-Liesse are involved in two of those projects separately, and we'll learn about their participation in those projects and then use that, as I said, to talk more generally about the relationship of those projects to the U.S. market overall. With that, and I'll offer some comments and thoughts along the way, as I'm sure our panelists will invite me to do so. Amit, maybe you can talk to us first about your company's role in the project at JFK and give us a sense of what is that project, what public details about it can you share with this audience that they might have an interest in knowing at this stage?
Certainly. Thank you, Eric, and thank you, everybody, for attending. Pleasure to be here. JFK is a unique project. So the redevelopment of JFK is the largest public-private infrastructure project that's ever been done in the United States. In fact, it's the largest airport project or transport project that's ever been done in the United States. So it is, the entire redevelopment is about a $13 billion undertaking. Much of it is done by the private sector through a public-private partnership, with, Marie will talk about the partnership that they've engaged in with JetBlue. We have engaged in a partnership with 4 airlines to redevelop Terminal 1. And what you'll see on the screen there, the image, which is currently JFK and the disparate terminals, with a lot of congestion, and then the reimagined, redeveloped JFK. And in the front there, as you enter JFK, is the redeveloped Terminal 1. The redeveloped Terminal 1 is approximately a $7.5 billion project. It spans 3 terminal sites that exist at JFK, the existing Terminal 1, the existing Terminal 2, where Delta runs its domestic operations primarily, and the Terminal 3 site, where there used to be a terminal, but no longer a terminal. It's simply a ramp for aircraft parking. The new Terminal 1 is going to be approximately 2.8 million square feet. It will be the largest terminal at JFK, and to give you sort of scale compared to some of the international terminals, it will be about 20% larger than Heathrow Terminal 2 and about 30% larger than Changi Terminal 4, so 2 of the more recent terminals that have opened internationally. It is also unique in that it is designed to be a purely international terminal. So one of the things that was lacking at JFK and in the New York market is capacity for wide-body gates to accommodate long-haul international travel. And so Terminal 1 it will not have a U.S. anchor airline, but it will be anchored by international airlines and will be predominantly serving the international long-haul market. Our current airline partners are Lufthansa, Air France, Japan Airlines, and Korean Airlines. And it's a unique partnership whereby the airlines are investing alongside financial sponsors led by Carlyle and working in partnership with the Port Authority to redevelop the terminal. There are a number of enabling projects that will go along, obviously, with a development like this. Everything from a completely redeveloped roadway system to access the terminal, to redeveloped ramps, taxiways, and utilities. So the other thing that the Port Authority and State of New York has really focused on is bringing about seamless travel experiences and connectivity. So in redeveloping the terminal, we're focused quite a bit on how do we bring about frictionless travel and have that passenger experience be elevated so that it is seamless as passengers flow through arrivals into the terminal building, processed through security, and to their gates. It's also about developing world-class retailing opportunities, world-class food and beverage opportunities, and really creating a marquee terminal on a global scale. So one of the areas that the Port Authority is really focused on, and something that is a key metric for us, is that the Port Authority wants JFK to be a top 10 Skytrax airport. And in particular, they want Terminal 1 to be a 5-star terminal based on Skytrax rankings. So essentially a top 5 airport terminal globally. So that is a key driver and a key metric for us, and it's gone into our design and development of the terminal. And also to give you sort of sense of timing, we are currently in discussions with the Port Authority to close out the lease agreement. We are quite advanced on our financing with committed financing for the project, and we are awaiting environmental approvals with a view to getting those in spring of next year and then beginning construction in the second quarter of 2020. It's about a 5-year construction period, with the terminal opening in phases, the first phase opening in 2023, and then final completion at the end of 2025.
Thanks for that. Marie, how about your project on the north side of the airport?
Sure. So basically, the project that Vantage is working on the north is the $3 billion boutique-style version of Amit's project. It's what's really interesting in what we're doing up there is JetBlue has been very, very active at JFK for 18 years since they really began operation there. And they are the second largest airline in terms of passenger traffic at JFK. And they've got a big footprint at Terminal 5, but next to Terminal 5 there is what used to be Terminal 6, and that was demolished and is vacant. Next to that is Terminal 7, which is an old terminal that was built in, I think, 1972. And next to that again, you have more vacant land, and then Terminal 8, where American airline operates. And what's really interesting in what's happening in the north is through JetBlue really embracing the vision of the governor to deliver a unified vision for the airport. They went to the market, when was that, 2.5 years ago, and decided to look for a couple of developer partners to help them through the process of redeveloping a terminal on what would be the empty Site 6, and then on Site 7, where the existing British Airways terminal is. So once we're done with it, and we are under the same environmental timeline as Amit's project, so we'll start as soon as they let us, and it will be about 1.2 million square feet, 12 wide-body gate, 3 billion. But what's really interesting, it will be again a new JetBlue-led terminal that would expand their footprint from Terminal 5 and Terminal 5I into a JetBlue-branded Terminal 6 and 7.
So what strikes me is a commonality among both these projects is obviously their unit terminal developments. They're privatizations, if you will, of a facility within an airport and not of the entire airport itself. They're also not necessarily unprecedented in the sense that I alluded to the successful public-private partnership underway for the redevelopment of the central terminal building at New York LaGuardia Airport, which is also a Vantage project, Marie, and I know you worked a lot on that because I worked a lot with you on that. Similarly, the Port Authority over 25 years ago issued a procurement and now has seen through a successful public-private partnership for Terminal 4 at JFK Airport. I think there are other examples of unit terminal projects around the United States that have been privately developed and or financed, including with airline sponsors, some more recently with other private developers and investors. Is this unit terminal method of introducing and encouraging more private participation in the U.S. airport sector a method that we expect to see more of? Is it, in fact, a U.S. model that's emerging that will be deployed more widely in both of your views?
So, Eric, that's a good point. So historically, the Port Authority has had a lot of experience in unit terminal development, and we're seeing, some other unit terminal development that's being led by airlines, for example, at LAX, where Southwest has done a lot of work at Terminal 1 and redeveloping Terminal 1, and a number of the other airlines have redeveloped terminals at LAX. So it is a model. It is a model that is only applicable to certain airports that have unit terminals that are discrete in themselves and can be developed in themselves. But the most interesting thing now, even in the New York area with the Port Authority, is that the Port Authority through the governor through the Port Authority is driving essentially connectivity. So Marie talked about the connectivity of Terminals 5, 6, and 7. We've talked about the connectivity of building a large terminal across 3 terminal sites, Terminals 1, 2, and 3. In addition to that, we are connected via a airside secure walkway. We will be connected to Terminal 4. So there'll be interconnectivity even at JFK. And LaGuardia also, there's sort of this connectivity that's happening with the central terminal building, but also the Delta development, where there will be connect those two terminals, those two developments will be connected. Although there have been these unit terminal projects, I think a lot of the airports are looking to see how do they function as an airport, right? So they don't have discrete governance structures, and how do you then have them function as an airport and build capacity at an airport? Because they're using essentially the same infrastructure.
And Marie, maybe a question for you along those lines is, as an operator and an investor in an airport, as Vantage is, how do you see the unique challenges and maybe benefits of owning and operating a unit terminal?
Yes, that's interesting, and that's why I think maybe also to address at the same time your question about could it work everywhere for everybody. It's tough to think so, because at some point, when you look at a unit terminal at a big airport, you'll compete. When you have, slot constrained or controlled environment, your competition, your level of competition may be reasonably manageable and healthy, where the potential for coordination and connectivity just outweigh, the negative of, outright war for airlines, which wouldn't be beneficial. So it's just finding that right balance in between competition, coordination, and a unified view of how the system needs to work. You always have the problem of interfaces. So look, it's going to surprise nobody that when at JFK you try and do $15 billion of construction work within 5 years, all done by probably 5 different developers. Interface may be a bit of a risk. That may not all work out as planned. So it will really depend on how well managed all these issues are. But when I go down to the question we ask ourselves at Vantage is, what problem are we trying to solve? And in the US in particular, airport infrastructure has been aging without being replaced. And terminals in particular are starting to have great need for large modernization and investment. And all of these airports have very, very complex environments. They have complex contractual structure with the airlines. They have site conditions that are challenging. They have to keep people traveling through the existing terminals. And so replacing all that infrastructure while keeping the infrastructure operational is sometimes too big of a challenge for one organization not to be asking the help of global operators or developers like Carlisle, Vantage, or Munich Airport for help, right? Because it's just complicated.
Yeah, I agree with you that I don't see it being a model that's going to be deployed widely across the U.S. airport community. I think there are places where, for specific reasons, going to your point, that what problem you're trying to solve, I think there will be a special interest in involving the private sector. Construction and development is one of them. Yeah. Airports, particularly when you're in the U.S. market and talking about redeveloping existing assets, are very complicated operations. And I think as public entities think about, one, their probably lack of resources and capacity to manage these types of projects successfully, but two, the risk involved in it. I mean, if you screw up an existing 24/7 airport operation, you've got a lot of potential liability and people looking at you. I think you might see public airport owners look to partner with private sector developers to, as we saw in LaGuardia and as you're seeing at JFK, take on those types of risk. But I don't, and then there's certain airports, JFK and Los Angeles International, which was also developed in a unit terminal structure, where I think just the structure of the airport lends itself to a unit terminal vision in some respects, where you might see more of it. But I think apart from that, it'll probably be sporadic. I guess I've heard of a couple projects where I would describe the risk profile of undertaking the project as being, so significant that I think the public operators are looking at private development and financing. But I think that's going to be also.
Yeah, you're right, Eric. I mean, it is. In the U.S. we talk a lot about risk transfer. I mean, it's and Marie-Liesse is right. I mean, it's about what is the problem we're trying to solve. How do we, what is the best way to transfer that risk, and what is the delivery strategy, right, around that. So we spend a lot of time, when we're talking to public owners. We spend a lot of time on trying to just basically figure out what is the right allocation of risk, what is the problem you're trying to solve, how do you want to deliver and procure and deliver. And sometimes, getting private sector involvement or private sector investment may not be the right answer. So in the US, the most interesting thing is, I think people approach it as a capital problem. It's really not a capital problem, it's a delivery problem, and it's a risk allocation problem. And you need to really sort of approach it from that perspective, because the ability for U.S. airports to finance themselves is, there's a long and deep history in deep municipal bond markets that continue to finance and are able to finance development of U.S. airports.
Mm-hmm. So how about more traditional private sector participation in airports? In the U.S. market, we have had in place since the early 1990s a framework for more liberalized ownership, if you will, of an airport by private interest. But that framework has been underutilized. Once in 2008, the city of Chicago attempted to privatize Chicago Midway Airport. Amit, you and I were involved in that effort. Twice. Eventually in 2012, I think it was, the San Juan International Airport became privatized under a similar construct, a long-term concession. But other than that, this program has largely been underutilized by the large commercial airports in the United States, until recently, perhaps. Just a week and a half ago, the city of St. Louis, and it's been talked about earlier at this discussion, this conference, has received 18 responses to a request for qualifications for the potential privatization of St. Louis Lambert International Airport. So we might be we're certainly on the verge of maybe attempting this again, and I think we all agree that if it's successful, that I think it gives a precedent for other policymakers to look to and a guide for them to accomplish something similar. But what were your reactions to the response to St. Louis? Did the number of responses surprise you? And how do you see that process playing out and the impact it'll have on the U.S. marketplace?
Look, we were not really surprised. We've been following that particular opportunity for a while now, and full disclosure, we're one of the 18. So when we look back at all the procurements that have taken place over the years in the US, it always attracts a lot of interest at first. It's the size of the potential market. It's just so enormous that everyone wants to do a deal. To get a foothold into that market. However, it doesn't mean that it starts with 18 that you'll end up with 18. Obviously, the list should get narrowed down through the procurement process. But as a way, it's also this process are really complicated, like Amit and the privatization of a full airport in the US is a slightly different beast than maybe anywhere else, and maybe it's just because it hasn't been done so many times in the past. but it will take a lot of effort and it will take people a lot of staying power. So the question is, how many will truly be interested when the full details of the transaction are being known, when the complexity of the transaction are understood, when the risk transfer is well known, when conversation with the airlines are allowed? This is really on the early stage.
No, I think you're right. I mean, so we're not involved. We were not one of the 18 that submitted, but it's not a surprise to us that 18 did submit. And I won't go into the details as to why we're not involved. But it is a complex program. The pilot program or the FAA privatization program is a complex program. Just going back to the 2008 days when, the process for Midway was undertaken, I think there were a similar number of initial responses to the RFQ as well. And then they were narrowed down to essentially 4, real bidders that emerged, and out of those only, sort of 2 remained that sort of got all the way through the process. So it is quite complex. It's an enormous undertaking, and there are a number of gates, a number of hurdles that one needs to go through. In terms of whether this will spur other airports to take a look at it, I'm still not sure. Although the process has been made easier, we have at Carlyle, we've provided direct input in how the privatization program can be made easier. We provided direct input to the Secretary of Transport, to the Secretary of Transportation. We provided direct input into Congress. Essentially to spur action. The FAA wants to spur action. They want to have more participants. But what's unique about the U.S. is that U.S. airports, as Eric mentioned, are really locally governed. They're locally driven. So although the federal government can put forward a structure, it is really up to local governments and local owners to decide to participate in a process of that nature. And airports generally tend to be, as you all know, very emotional assets, and especially in the U.S. Given their local framework, they're highly, highly emotional, and so unless there's a real compelling reason to look for a full privatization of an airport, similar to what St. Louis is doing, or what Chicago attempted to do, I think it's going to be rare that we'll see airports come in and participate in a program like that. And yes, I mean, and Marie's absolutely right. The U.S. is a large market globally. The airports are large airports in their own rights. Even some of the mid-sized airports are relatively large airports, and there's a scarcity value, and equity and developers want to participate in the market. So initial responses will be high when processes like that start.
What do you think, Eric?
I think policymakers need an example before you invest the political capital that's necessary to do something. I think most policymakers do. And in that sense, I think completing another transaction will inevitably lead to others considering similar transactions, whether or not other transactions get executed. I think there's a greater probability of that. But as both of you noted, I think it's very difficult for political reasons and others to see a lot of this getting done, certainly in the short term in the U.S. market. Mm-hmm. I think one thing that concerns me about the U.S. market is I think, going back to the point of what are you trying to do this for, I think airports that go the route of inviting private sector participation, either through a public-private partnership or even a privatization, are going to have different objectives. And the objectives probably will be, monetization in some sense, but I don't know that will be the highest priority. So I think that there will be a lot of subjective factors that go into determining who the right partner is or who the best bidder is, and that may be a tough road to navigate for both bidders and for the public sector entities that are making these decisions. So I think there's a lot that's yet unresolved about how the U.S. market will unfold. But I think those of us who follow it are looking forward to the St. Louis process, which is a sound process to date, to help answer questions about how the path will be blazed for future transactions. One thing I want to ask you both about, to the extent there is a common model that is developing for privatizations in the United States, when you look at Midway, you look at San Juan, you look at other attempted privatizations like Westchester County a couple years ago, it's focused on an airline agreement with a fixed price that the airlines agree to pay at the outset that is then escalated based on inflation over time. And maybe that's a byproduct of what you mentioned, Amit, which is the pretty strict federal privatization program requirements that require really supermajority airline support for these. Do both of you see these types of airline agreements as investment and operator positives or negatives? Do you think that there are other ways that you would hope or expect or think the U.S. market could develop, or do you think that these fixed agreements are the way to go?
Well, I think there is precedent-setting value in those agreements, because when airlines, in relation to a potential privatization or a group of airlines, get comfortable with a certain structure of an airline agreement with the private sector for one deal, and then can reuse most of that structure for the next one, and so on, it would maybe slowly but surely get us to a place where we have a little bit of standardization and precedent setting in the market in a way that would help transaction getting to market more efficiently. So that would be on the positive side. On the negative side, obviously, is it doesn't necessarily provide a ton of flexibility, and the regulatory environment in the US, as you know more than most, is actually quite flexible and quite effective. And when we go back to where should the risk lie, sometime wanting to push necessarily all the risk to the investor and to the developer for no good reason is not necessarily the ultimate, most efficient solution. And when risk is shared across a group of stakeholders, there is also more flexibility to work together to mitigate that risk. So maybe it's I see some benefit in having airlines really getting used to the structure, because that way we don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. But it's at the cost of maybe some flexibility that the regulatory environment otherwise already offer in the US, and that is quite useful.
Yeah, I mean, what I would add to that is, there is no economic regulation of rates and charges of pricing in the U.S. For U.S. airports, with the exception of it needs to be non-discriminatory. These types of airline agreements really essentially become sort of the de facto price regulator, so to speak. And I think standardization is helpful, but again, when we start to look at how these airline agreements become price regulators, I agree that there needs to be a view to what is the level of price setting to encourage an adequate economic return. And sometimes, when you have an airline agreement that essentially transfers risk to the developer, it makes it very, very difficult then to economically justify a project. So, that's another hurdle, I think. To Marie's point, I think that's another hurdle that exists in the U.S. market in sort of how do you start to move projects forward. So, when we look at sort of the different stakeholders in the U.S., we've got airports that are locally owned, highly politically charged. We've got airlines that are looking to transfer risk. We've got essentially developers and equity that are trying to make an adequate return. Bringing all of that together is a steep undertaking, and it takes a lot of time. And sometimes the time, given sort of political cycles and stuff like that, you've got projects that can start and stop, and really some that don't even see the light of day. So it's a unique market. It's a market that has encouraging signs with some of these developments we've talked about. But it is a market that does require a lot of patience and being able to stick to it.
That's probably a good place to wrap it up. We've got a couple good questions. I'll ask one of them, but maybe I should see if there are any audience questions that we want to address before we adjourn to the next panel. Well, let me ask you both a question that relates to how U.S. airports generally are poorly linked to the transportation system outside of an airport. Amit, you've gotten a question about how your project at JFK could possibly receive a 5-star Skytrax rating without a great rail link. But maybe if I could broaden that question and say, how does that poor linkage between U.S. airports generally and other modes of ground transportation in particular, how does that frustrate operational and investment considerations for a private participant in the U.S. market?
It is a significant consideration. So, because passenger journeys really start from when the time you leave your home or your office, or so getting to the airport is a big factor. And how do you get to the airport as efficiently as possible? So, I think cities and more cities are looking at how do they improve public transport links to an airport. They're expensive. In JFK's case, there has been a concerted effort to talk about what's called a one-seat ride, which is a direct rail line that runs from Manhattan to JFK. It'll take many years before that's realized, and so the solution currently is essentially improving the road network that accesses JFK. So there is access to JFK that is being not only sort of the road network that feeds into JFK and serves all terminals, but then the access roads that are coming into JFK are also being improved. A lot of it's being done by the state of New York. So lane widening, hot lanes, things of that nature. There's also a concerted effort by the Port Authority to improve what the AirTrain system, which the current subway links into. So although it's not the most efficient, but the Port Authority is looking to improve frequency of the AirTrain system and also adding additional cars to the AirTrain. So I think it's recognized by the port that it is important to have adequate public access, and they are trying to do it. But building direct rail links is something that's highly challenging and will take a long time to do.
Thank you for the response. Well, thank you all. We appreciate your attention and time.